Angus Maddison, you have just published, or we have just published for you, the second edition of your Chinese economic performance in the long run. What prompted you to write this book in the first place?
Well, I was always interested in what happened in China because when I was in the Air Force, I was an education officer and I had to educate the troops in current affairs, and Chairman Mao came into the middle of my responsibilities at that time. I didn't know much about him. I thought he was an agrarian reformer, so I was very much pro Chairman Mao. But then later on, I tried to write a book in 1965 about China, Russia, and Japan. And I find it very easy to meet people in Moscow or in Tokyo, but not in China. I couldn't get any contact whatsoever. So I put it aside for a while, and then in 1970 I was in Harvard for 6 months, where I learned a lot from Dwight Perkins and John Fairbank, who were American specialists in Chinese history. And then eventually I waited until I'd retired from being a professor to writing the book on China, where the circumstances had changed completely. I mean, I find it much easier to get information, and in the meantime I'd boned up on sources of Chinese history, and I spent a couple of years on that book.
And now we're releasing the second edition of your landmark study on Chinese economic performance in the long run. What's changed, do you think, since the original publication in, I believe it was 1998, until today's version?
That's right. Well, nothing much has changed in the historical chapters. And in the annex, I had a long chapter on Chinese agriculture, where I try to check the official publications by looking at FAO data. And I found that the Chinese estimates were more or less spot on. I mean, they agreed with what I had. But for industry and service sector, there were differences. And I'd made some rough corrections for that earlier on, and I could refine that later. But also, in the first edition, I thought it would be very difficult for China to get rid of all these state enterprises and also to reform the financial system. And they've done that more easily than I thought was possible, so that this time when I was stressing problems for the future, they were more about inequality and income distribution and energy than there had been in the first one. In the first one, energy wasn't a problem at all. But since then, China has become very polluted, as you and I witnessed when we were in Peking together in '97. Since then, it's got worse. So I think that is a major problem for China. So the problems of the future are different in this volume from what they were previously.
Talking of the future, of course, the impossible question is, and I have to ask you, is now that we have a financial crisis which appears to be global and relatively lengthy, does this change a lot, your analysis of the next 20 years, 25 years in China, or do you think China will continue unscathed, as it were?
No, my projection for China was rather conservative. I mean, I thought that there would be a slowdown, have to be a slowdown, as China caught up with the West. Once you catch up, you have to have innovation rather than imitation, and Japanese experience was one of very rapid growth, and then when they hit the Western level, it just, more or less stopped after the mid-1990s. And I think that is a problem if you have a country growing so fast where, consumption is half of the income, redistributing things and getting a new equilibrium is difficult. So my forecasts were more modest than, say, the Goldman Sachs people or some others who made projections for China.
So basically you stick to your original projections. Given that they were modest, you think that they are not going to be radically changed by the current economic climate in the world?
I think I more or less made an allowance for fluctuations in the West. And I projected a tapering off of Chinese growth of 5.6% up to 2010, 4.6 up to 2020, and 3.6% up to 2030, a sort of gradual diminution of their growth rate. And in fact, the growth rate so far, even including the slowdown this year, is faster than I had predicted for the first section of this projection.
Angus Maddison, thank you very much, and we look forward to the third edition of Chinese Economic Performance in the long run.
Thank you.